Long before the world knew of Lord Voldemort's return, a hush had settled upon Wizarding Britain like a dark cloud on the horizon. Harry Potter, battered by the events of the Triwizard Tournament, tried to convince the authorities, magical and Muggle alike, of Voldemort's return. Yet all calls fell on skeptical ears, while Fudge, then Minister for Magic, clung to a blissful ignorance. Those in the Muggle government had only the faintest inkling that something big and dangerous was brewing just out of sight. There had been oddities, sure. Reports of unnatural storms, suspicious kidnappings, and sightings of black-robed figures that the press was quick to dismiss as hoaxes or illusions. But among high-ranking Muggle officials, a dull suspicion began forming, one that told them these strange occurrences weren't coincidences. They recognized that an unseen war was on the brink of exploding into the open. They had, of course, zero proof until the night that a Muggle-born wizard named Benedict Quinn, who also happened to be the grandson of a British Prime Minister, decided enough was enough. Benedict had dual loyalties running in his veins: the Muggle world he grew up in and the magical realm that had welcomed him at 11. He'd left Hogwarts not too many years before Harry first arrived, though they had no direct encounters. He served under the watchful eye of Alastair Moody for a short while, learning the ropes of Auror life. However, after one too many times seeing the damage inflicted by dark wizards upon unsuspecting Muggles, Benedict resigned from the ministry, angry at its lack of real cooperation with Muggle institutions. He maintained ties with some members of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, but he returned to London to work alongside his grandfather, a retired statesman who still had the ear of the current Prime Minister. In private, the two had many conversations about forging a real alliance between Muggle authorities and Wizarding authorities. But neither man had the impetus nor the official blessing to take the first step. Then came the night that the Death Eaters tried to target a prominent Muggle technology firm in the heart of London. Their motive was unknown, but it was rumored that Lucius Malfoy believed certain cutting-edge research might help them detect and track individuals like Harry Potter through advanced satellite imaging. It was a bizarre notion that dark magic and satellite technology might intertwine, but as the Wizarding War escalated, so too did the dark creativity of Voldemort and his followers. In a stroke of cosmic luck, Benedict was on the scene when masked Death Eaters attempted to infiltrate the building. Without hesitation, he dueled two of them, blasting them with stunners that left cracks in the marble walls. The commotion triggered the building's high-tech security systems. Muggle police rushed in, confusion plastered on their faces as they witnessed what they could only describe as an impossible light show. Sparks flew, alarms shrieked. In the chaos, Benedict quietly took charge, barking for the officers to get the civilians out. He conjured a shield charm to deflect a killing curse, letting it fizzle into the ceiling. When the Death Eaters realized they were attracting more attention than they'd bargained for, they disapparated, leaving behind two unconscious accomplices. Before obliviators from the ministry could sweep in and wipe minds, Benedict slipped away with the police, insisting that they keep the scene intact and remain on high alert. He knew that if the ministry was given free rein, they'd obliviate the entire event out of existence and bury any chance of Muggle-Wizard cooperation. This public incident made its way to the current Prime Minister, who found himself in a locked conference room the next morning with Benedict, the police commissioner, and a pair of deeply rattled local MPs. Benedict laid out the truth, carefully, methodically, acknowledging how outlandish it all sounded. He explained the existence of a parallel society with spells, wands, and hidden enclaves. Some politicians believed him immediately, especially because of the security footage capturing flickers of bright bursts that looked nothing like normal gunfire. Others were in denial, suspecting this was a trick or advanced technology from a foreign threat. Tensions soared until Benedict produced a wand and levitated the entire table in the middle of the meeting. And just like that, the Muggle world could no longer remain in the dark. If there was any final vestige of doubt, it evaporated when Benedict revealed photographs of the two captured Death Eaters, bound and unconscious, and explained that they would be freed if the ministry had its way. A wave of uneasy realization washed over the Muggle officials. There was a war at hand, and they were not simply bystanders. News traveled fast in political circles. Within days, the British Prime Minister made an urgent visit to the reclusive Minister for Magic, Rufus Scrimgeour, who had just succeeded the beleaguered Fudge. Scrimgeour, a hardened Exorer, was far from happy that the Muggle Prime Minister possessed any knowledge of the Wizarding War beyond the standard official disclaimers. But the sense of crisis was too real to ignore. When pressed about the severity of the threat, Scrimgeour admitted that Lord Voldemort was not just an issue for wizards alone. He had tried to remain hidden, but with each day, more Muggles were harmed, buildings were destroyed, and lives were lost. The Muggle Prime Minister demanded cooperation. He wanted collaboration, open channels, intelligence sharing, and in return, the Muggle government would provide resources that might help the wizarding forces in ways they had never imagined. Scrimgeour was torn. Wizarding law forbade open revelation of magical secrets to Muggles, but these were extraordinary circumstances. He remembered reading about Grindelwald's short-lived global havoc decades ago. Even then, Muggle governments hadn't banded together with wizards. There had been only confusion and horror. But this time, the magical community was outnumbered, outgunned if one considered the potential for widespread panic. And these Death Eaters weren't playing by the old rules. They'd begun using Imperius curses on unsuspecting Muggle leaders, planting seeds of chaos in international courts. Something had to be done to stop that infiltration, or else wizarding secrecy wouldn't matter much. Reluctantly, he agreed. They would form a covert intergovernmental council, staffed by a handful of Aurors, Muggle military personnel, intelligence agents, and magical liaisons like Benedict. Their mission: identify Voldemort's strongholds, track down Death Eaters, and share technology, intelligence, and magical means to bring the Dark Lord to his knees. Meanwhile, Harry Potter, Ron Weasley, and Hermione Granger were in the thick of the hunt for Horcruxes. They had gleaned key intel about the nature of Voldemort's immortality, and they were sneaking through the countryside, occasionally returning to Grimmauld Place to coordinate with the Order of the Phoenix. They were shocked by the news that the Muggle government was aware of the wizarding conflict on such a deep level, and that the Prime Minister himself had quietly sanctioned the creation of an elite unit known as the Blackthorn Task Force, a name suggested by Benedict, referencing the Blackthorn wood used in certain wands. The trio was told to expect Muggle troops in potential conflict zones, including certain deserted villages rumored to harbor Death Eater enclaves. For the first time, Muggle devices like night vision goggles, thermal imaging, and encrypted radio communications would be used alongside wizarding detection spells. In the months that followed, the new alliance was put to the test. The Death Eaters, emboldened by Voldemort's dark creed, launched terror attacks across magical and Muggle London. Dementors were set loose in the outskirts of major cities, causing mass depression and fear so thick it rippled through neighborhoods. But for once, Muggles were not as hopeless as they'd been. Armed with a rudimentary understanding of Patronus charms, though they couldn't cast them themselves, they provided cover for the Aurors who could, and advanced weaponry. Task Force members bravely held positions under swirling black storm clouds conjured by the Dark Lord's lieutenants. The synergy was awe-inspiring. A squad of Muggle commandos used specialized riot gear shields made of Kevlar and layered with an enchantment courtesy of a Hogwarts professor to deflect curses. On the front lines, Aurors like Tonks and Kingsley Shacklebolt cast defensive spells with renewed vigor, knowing that retreat was less likely when they had bulletproof vests under their robes and the watchful eyes of snipers scanning the rooftops for masked figures. The Alliance didn't stop at the battlefield. High-level Muggle intelligence agencies, from MI6 to the CIA, and eventually other governments that caught wind of the crisis, pooled satellite data to detect large gatherings of cloaked individuals in remote areas of the British Isles. Instead of relying solely on broomstick reconnaissance or magical trackers, wizarding and Muggle experts combined efforts. They discovered clandestine meeting spots, hideouts, and supply routes used by Voldemort's acolytes. The smugness of many Death Eaters waned as their secrecy was systematically peeled away. They tried to counter with illusions and memory charms, but they found Muggle training in psychological resilience and constant threat alerts often stymied the typical infiltration tactics. Even so, losses were heavy on both sides. Magic was still devastating. Avada Kedavra was unstoppable by normal means. The Muggle task force was forced to develop a strategy of specialized gear and positioning that minimized direct line of sight with Death Eaters. They set up decoy units, illusions conjured by wizarding allies, and trap-laden fields dotted with explosive ordnance that had been charmed to detonate only if triggered by wands. Voldemort, furious that his domain of fear was being challenged by Muggles, mere non-magical beings, sought to remind them of the power of the dark arts. He orchestrated an assault on Parliament itself, choosing a day when the Prime Minister was ironically meeting with Scrimgeour to strategize about the mounting crisis. Under the cover of night, a group of Death Eaters soared on broomsticks, sweeping over the Thames. They launched curses that shattered windows and toppled statues. Alarm bells rang, and the building was evacuated. But the Blackthorn Task Force was prepared. They had installed magical wards around the perimeter, small but potent amplifiers of protective enchantments. Aurors apparat to the site within seconds, and Muggle snipers took out 2 Death Eaters mid-flight before they could cast more than a few spells. It was a horrifying scene. Curses sliced through the air, leaving scorched marks on the centuries-old stone. Screams echoed across the night, though many legislators had already been hustled away to safe rooms. One of the wards collapsed under the barrage of dark magic, letting a handful of Death Eaters break through, but they didn't make it far. A combined team of Aurors and SAS operatives cornered them in a hall, and after a frantic exchange of hexes and gunfire, the Death Eaters were subdued. The surviving intruders took flight in a whirl of black robes, cackling with frustrated rage as they fled. The message was clear. No place was safe, wizarding or Muggle. It only hardened the Muggle Prime Minister's resolve. Soon, the alliance grew bolder. Coordinated raids took place across England, Wales, and even parts of Scotland where rumored enclaves existed. After a tip-off from a double agent within Voldemort's ranks, the Blackthorn Task Force targeted an old castle ruin in the Highlands that reportedly served as a storage site for cursed artifacts. This mission read like something out of a thriller. Muggle helicopters hovered at a distance, waiting to drop teams of armed soldiers. On the ground, wizarding folk discreetly cast illusions so that any local villagers would see nothing more than a few lost tourists. When the operation commenced, the Death Eaters inside the ruin put up a vicious fight. Harsh green bolts of the killing curse lit the night. Hermione, who had joined the assault with Ron while Harry was off pursuing a Horcrux lead, recalled the intensity of the battle. How Muggle gunfire rippled through the ruins, how spells deflected and ricocheted off stone walls, how curses and smoke and fear clashed in a symphony of chaos. In the end, they secured the site, capturing valuable dark objects. Several Death Eaters escaped, but the body count of captured enemies was not small. Even the famously stoic Kingsley Shacklebolt admitted he was impressed and deeply grateful for the Muggle support. Without those additional eyes, that overhead cover, or the suppressed firearms that pinned the Death Eaters down, the mission might have ended in total failure. Back in the shadows, Voldemort seethed. The infiltration tactics, the illusions, the calculated fear, none of it was working as smoothly as before. Sure, the magical community was still terrified of him, and some corners of Muggle society had no clue how dire things really were. But each day, the new alliance chipped away at his dominion. He desperately sought an advantage. He discovered that while wizards typically scorned Muggle technology, certain cunning uses of it could be beneficial. Devising a twisted plan, he ordered a small contingent of his most loyal servants, Bellatrix Lestrange among them, to place Imperius curses on scientists working in a secret research facility. Bellatrix boasted that they might harness nuclear technology to create an unstoppable magical bomb, fusing dark energy with raw atomic power. The concept was abominable, a threat to wizard and Muggle alike, but the notion of the ultimate doomsday device was tempting for the Dark Lord. He had never taken Muggle science seriously, but now he saw how it could sow unimaginable terror. Unfortunately for him, the intelligence network caught wind of strange happenings at that very facility. The moment the infiltration was confirmed, the Blackthorn Task Force sprang into action, collaborating with local security. It was a harrowing operation, far more delicate than any prior mission. The meltdown of a nuclear reactor would devastate millions. Tense negotiations and infiltration were attempted first. Wizards disguised themselves as employees, using Polyjuice Potion to move through restricted areas. Muggle special ops teams remained on standby outside the facility. Ultimately, a single, massive confrontation erupted in the control room. Bellatrix, eyes wild, cackled as she cast lethal curses at anyone who stepped too close, but she was outnumbered and had grown overconfident. By the time the Aurors locked down the reactor room, the Muggle task force had forcibly subdued or killed the Imperius guards. Hermione managed to cast a well-timed shield charm that saved a researcher from a lethal curse, though Bellatrix escaped in the frenzy, leaving a swirl of black robes and malignant laughter echoing in the halls. The Alliance prevented a catastrophic meltdown. It was a victory that cost them dearly in casualties, yet the success was beyond measure. Meanwhile, Harry's quest for Horcruxes took a dangerous turn. He had destroyed a few, but the final confrontation loomed on the horizon. Dumbledore was gone. Snape's loyalties were uncertain to most, though Harry and his friends held onto a kernel of hope. The inevitable confrontation with Voldemort would require all the help they could muster, Muggle or Wizard. In the final weeks of the war, Muggle governments stepped up in an unprecedented manner. Leaders from France, Germany, and even the United States quietly reached out to Britain's Prime Minister. They wanted to know the scope of this threat. Was it limited to one country, or could it spread? They authorized small task forces of their own, trained in the basics of wizarding conflict, to support the fight on English soil, all under the greatest secrecy. International squads set up around major wizarding hotspots like Diagon Alley and Hogsmeade, ensuring that if the Death Eaters decided to attempt a mass assault, they would face both magical wards and well-armed Muggle defenders. When word finally came that Voldemort and Harry were dueling in the Great Hall of Hogwarts, the last stand in the broader war, scores of Muggle soldiers were stationed on the outskirts. Minister Scrimgeour had given special approval for a handful of them to pass through the protective wards around the castle. Hogwarts was the ultimate stronghold of magic, and many believed only wizarding forces could truly protect it. Yet the presence of Muggle allies offered a morale boost few could have anticipated. Students who had never used a telephone, let alone a firearm, looked on in awe at the disciplined men and women who stood guard, scanning the perimeter for signs of infiltration. The battle inside the castle was furious beyond words. Spells collided in midair, echoing with thunderous impact. Giants, trolls, and Dementors added chaos to the swirling melee. But outside the walls, Muggle spotters with night vision gear picked off rogue Death Eaters trying to scale certain sections. Their strategy was simple. They would not let any Death Eater disrupt the momentous duel that was culminating in the Great Hall. In that final duel, as history would record, Harry Potter destroyed Voldemort with the Elder Wand. The prophecy reached its resolution. The shards of darkness that had corrupted Tom Riddle's soul fell to nothing. Screams of disbelief echoed from the remaining Death Eaters, who either fled or were apprehended. In the shaky aftermath, the wizarding world stood side by side with the Muggle soldiers who had helped stave off a grimmer fate. The Allied forces took stock of the devastation at Hogwarts. Shattered walls, collapsed archways, but also living proof that unity could triumph over tyranny. Students embraced Muggle officers in gratitude. A few daring Muggle troopers asked if they could hold wands, only to be gently reminded that such artifacts would do them little good without magical ability. Through tears and relief, everyone recognized that a new chapter in Wizard-Muggle relations had been written. No more would the magical world stand completely apart. The cost in lives was too high, the risk of ignoring each other's strengths too great. After the fall of Voldemort, the question arose: how do you keep wizarding secrecy intact when so many Muggle operatives, officials, and soldiers knew the truth? They had fought in these battles, bled alongside wizards. It was impossible to just obliviate them all. The new Minister for Magic considered a large-scale memory wipe, but was vehemently opposed by Benedict Quinn and others in the newly established Magical Muggle Liaison Office. Scrimgeour, though he had survived the war, was wounded and more aware than ever of how crucial the Muggle alliance had been. Ultimately, a compromise was reached. Wizarding secrecy would still be preserved for the general public, but certain Muggle leaders and top security personnel would remain in the know, forming a permanent council that would coordinate on any future cross-societal threats. This meant forging new protocols for when magical criminals escaped into Muggle cities, or when Muggle tech might infringe on the magical realm. It was a precarious balance, but it was better than turning a blind eye to each other's existence. In the months and years that followed, stories circulated in pubs both magical and mundane. Of the night wizards and muggles fought side by side under swirling Dementor-filled skies, of the day helicopters hovered over ancient castle ruins as spells crackled like fireworks, of the final hours at Hogwarts when Muggle and wizarding blood spilled together to buy time for Harry and Voldemort's fate-altering showdown. Some wizards, especially pure-blood families, bristled at the idea that Muggles had lent such a hand in defeating he who must not be named. But the younger generation saw hope in the partnership. Now that the war was over, perhaps new friendships would blossom. Maybe the day would come when a Muggle soldier and an Auror could share a pint at the Leaky Cauldron, or a bright teenage Muggle mathematician could collaborate with a Hogwarts arithmancy professor to push both magical and scientific frontiers. The alliances made in wartime sometimes melted away in times of peace, but a quiet vow was taken by the principal figures on both sides. Never again would a threat like Voldemort be allowed to rise unnoticed and unchallenged. Harry, in a rare public statement after the war, acknowledged the invaluable contribution of the Muggle governments. He spoke with humility about how it was everyone's fight, wizard or Muggle, because evil doesn't discriminate based on magical blood. He recalled the nerves he felt seeing Muggle troops on the Hogwarts grounds for the first time, and how surreal it was to hear the rattle of gunfire mixing with the sizzle of stunning spells. He also gave a tearful thanks to Benedict Quinn, who stood by him in the final hours, ensuring that no infiltration would interfere with the confrontation. In a quiet voice, Harry recounted how it was in that shared crucible that he realized the barrier between magic and non-magic was mostly of the mind. They were all people, feeling the same fear, risking their lives for the same dream of a future without the shadow of a Dark Lord. Thus concluded the war that would be recorded in wizarding and Muggle history alike, not with the names of individuals overshadowing all else, but with the remarkable notion that a common threat forged an unprecedented unity. No illusions, no manipulations, just honesty, necessity, and courage holding them together under the banner of hope. And so the legend spread far and wide, a testament to what could happen when differences are set aside. For as it turned out, the greatest magic of all was the spark of unity between worlds once thought irreconcilable.